Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming today and being with us. As you can see, there are cameras here. So please just be aware that this is being recorded. It's going to go up on the HSAN, the Australasian Human Studies Network's YouTube channel, where this kind of was born, this idea of Eric's talk here about the human right to listen and to be heard, and which is also why we've got amazing guests here with us today to talk about listening, being heard, the human rights angle from all kinds of different perspectives. And I'm going to introduce the guests in a bit. Before I do that, I would just like to welcome you all to the University of Sydney, which is located, I'd like to acknowledge, on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are and have always been the traditional owners. So this event, with the tagline, "How do we listen?" it is part of the 2023 Humour as a Human Rights Conference, an annual event hosted by the Australasian Humour Studies Research Network. And you might actually see two more people from the HSAN sneak in a bit late. So let's see if Jessica and Rob make it. I'm happy to have convened the conference's main events earlier this year with my colleague Rodney Tavera from the American Studies Centre here at the University of Sydney. The conference took place in February, where we had 2 full days of online presentations and 2 full days of on-campus, in-person panels and talks. One talk was by Eric Loebecker, who presented his listening devices artworks as a series of think pieces on the human right to listen and to be heard, which builds on a humorous platform of visual arts, cartooning, satire, and creative plasticity. And if you're interested, Eric's artworks are already up in the Law Library. They're going to be there for a couple of months, so check them out if you have not already done so. Eric is going to be talking about this in a moment. To start things off, as I just said, Eric will give a very short introduction to his art that you can all find here at the university. And thanks again to Vanessa and Belinda from the University Library. Really, really appreciate it. It's a lot of work and you made it happen, so we're very much thankful. The artworks are accompanied by a set of small sculptures and a video that plays on the monitor screen there as well. So if you walk over there, it's not very far from here. You will see it all happen there. A lot of my students actually came up to me and say, "So is this artworks thing that you're going to have the event on? Is that Eric?" I was like, yeah. And they were like, I didn't tell them how much they were. I can't really afford them. But here they are up for sale. So Eric might talk to you about that later. There is also a QR code that you can scan with your phone that will take you to the exhibition context and more information about the artwork series that is called, as we said before, Listening Devices. I'm Ben Nicola, lecturer in the School of Languages and Cultures, specifically the discipline of International Comparative Literature and Translation Studies, so that's my background here. And I will be moderating the panel discussion that is going to happen after Eric's short overview at the beginning. I'll be introducing all of the guests, and then we have a short discussion and then throw it over to the audience for questions and answers. The discussion itself will be about 40 minutes, give or take, 50 if we waffle. So hopefully that's not happening. It will be concluded with a poem read by Saba Sefi, a lecturer here at the University of Sydney in the School of Media and a dear colleague. So also again, thanks for coming. Then we will stop and open the floor to questions from the audience. With that being said, let me quickly introduce Eric and then throw it over to him. Eric Loebecker. Eric's practice is born of his 32 years of participation in the Australian media landscape as a political cartoonist and opinion page illustrator on the Australian newspaper. Since 2016, he has completed a Master of Fine Art by coursework degree at UNSW Art and Design, followed up with a 2-year full-time Masters of Fine Art research paper on the topic of disrupting the cartoonist working model for the digital paradigm. This allowed him to continue his painting practice and conflate his inquiry with traditional painting and time-based digital painting to exhibit his work most recently within a cultural institution, the Museum of Australian Democracy, Old Parliament House, Canberra, and within a fine art gallery context, Stella Downer Fine Art Gallery here in Sydney in 2020. Give it up for Eric, and please come over here.
So thank you, Ben. And that was the first part of my speech. So really, you pretty much know exactly what I'm going to be talking about. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the university for having this for me, and also for being on Gadigal land and being able to speak freely. Speaking freely is about being able to voice your opinion. So what I usually do is for 32 years, I voiced my opinion with my drawings on the newspaper, and that allowed me a big audience. And then after the 32 years, I was made redundant, and then I had to find my new way of voicing my opinion again. Um, the point is, I want to be listened to, and that's that's a when I look at the way that I do my work, it's usually something that requires a very contemplative thought and slow thinking. Which is not what happened when I was at the newspaper. When I was at the newspaper, I was actually thinking very quickly, and what I needed to do was I needed to um, uh, put out a drawing within 3 or 4 hours about somebody else's opinion. So I was looking at somebody else's opinion and formulating my own visual from that, and then getting it out by 7:30. So after 32 years, I got very good at it, and I'm very quick at drawing. So I was going to use that in my fine art, but it was COVID, and at that time, I was doing it so quickly, drawing from the opinion page, because I knew how to do it so quickly. I had plenty of other time, so I was listening, and obviously I was listening to the news, and I was listening to our government at the time, and also we had Donald Trump in the US, and there was a lot of noise being made, and this noise was translated in a lot of misogyny, I thought, and a lot of a lot of misogyny. So what I was thinking about at the time was how our government was looking at the issue of the Me Too movement at the time. And it was really interesting because we also had a government that wasn't listening to women at the time. And so we had Brittany Higgins with her rape allegation that was not being listened to. We had Grace Tame, Australian of the Year. She wasn't being listened to, or she made a real good point of that. And then we had what really got me going on these things was that we had a government with no ears, not listening to Christine Holgate, who came in and she revolutionised Australian Post. She actually did really well, and she made a really big profit for Australian Post. Yet it wasn't politically expedient to have her there, and Scott Morrison went up in Parliament and actually derided her and said, get rid of her. We don't need her. Whatever. So she had to resign. But then at the committee, she came in. So there was a committee meeting about what had happened, and she came in with the white suit, and that really impressed me because I thought, okay, well, what's the white suit about? So in my research, I found out that the suffragettes wore the white suit. And I thought, okay, well, there's a lot of symbolism happening here, and it's really quite good. So I started thinking about how I could make these earpieces for men with no ears. And so this is probably one of the last ones. But I started off, if you go downstairs and have a look, I started off with a big flower because, I mean, being a cartoonist, I was very directed on literal interpretations. And so a big flower. So it starts with a big flower, man without ears yelling, So, and I kept on going. But what I was also doing at that time was, because I was transitioning from being a cartoonist to an artist through my MFA. I was doing an MFA at the time, and I was doing what were called works in progress. So the works in progress was me doing my opinion page, but on a weekly basis on one topic, and then they became drawings that were made into an animation, and I got my wife to actually do the narration for it, and they were published in the newspaper at the time. 75 of these drawings, one a week. So I got really quick at drawing and coming up with a logical narrative. So it was good fun to do, and my MFA then came up with 75 drawings at the end. But I was also learning how to use the iPad as a painting tool, and to me that was really exciting because it became a really strong painting tool. And I think I came to university with, and Joan taught me at university, and that was what was in my head at the time. And Joan said to me, monumentalize it. And so this is monumentalizing it. And so I then started using plasticine photography, and I started to use plasticine as a drawing tool on the iPad. And then I had to make them unique because whatever comes out of an iPad gets disseminated to a million times. So I had to make those works unique. So I then printed them out and I'm painting over the top of them so to make them unique. So all the artworks now underneath us are all unique artworks, and they're artworks that can be sold in a gallery, and that was the main reason I did that. But I also do the video work because I did the video work for Work in Progress, and so I've got an oeuvre now that's a multimedia oeuvre. Anyway, so really, so we've come to this point where we're thinking about listening, and I've put out these images about listening, and then the good thing about what I do is that I can bring it out to a wider audience on Instagram and Facebook, and I've got quite a nice following. It's only 1,000 people, but these people actually feed because of the Work in Progress. They allow themselves to give me ideas or to talk to me on that device or on a device. And so Jenny McCracken, who does these beautiful murals on water tanks, came up and said to me, like we only talk on social media, but I've known Jenny for a long time because we used to do Chalk the Walk together, and she said there is a concept called Daradiri, and so this is the Aboriginal concept of slow listening and respectful listening. And I think this is where I am at the moment. I'm at slow, respectful listening. So I think I'm going to leave the talk at that point so that we can really talk about that point. So thank you for listening.
Right. So now with this little intro, might I just ask our guests to come up here and just find a chair if you'd like. So we're now just throwing it open to the guests and to talk about, as we're setting up for the discussion round, talk a bit more about this act of listening and the human right to listen and to be heard. There you go. From these different, Saba, you want to just grab this? That's fine. Sorry, just fine. No, that's fine. And find kind of, maybe a common thread, maybe we can get this dialogue going more organically, but each of our guests has a very different and distinct take, but we found there might be a red thread kind of going through all of this. So just quickly, I'm going to introduce the guests in alphabetical order. You already know Eric, but you do not, I think, maybe know who Joan is. So Joan Ross, bold and experimental. Joan Ross's practice investigates the legacy of colonialism in Australia with a particular focus on reconfiguring the colonial Australian landscape and drawing attention to the complex and ongoing issues surrounding the effects of globalization and colonization. Since the late 1980s, Joan has exhibited across a range of mediums from drawing, painting, photography, and sculpture to installation, video, and virtual reality. Recent projects include designing the hoarding for the Art Gallery of New South Wales' Sydney Modern Expansion and illuminating the facade of the National Gallery of Australia during the 2021 Enlighten Festival. In 2023, Joan received the National Art School Fellowship, congratulations, and the Valerie Taylor Art Prize for Ocean Advocacy. And I urge you to check out her work. The neon work with the these colors, I think is brilliant, and I just pops off the screen, so I'm really a big fan of that. Nicole Matthews, just here, hails from Macquarie University. It was so nice to come all the way and help track figures. We haven't talked about that. Associate Professor Nicole Matthews lectures across media and culture studies at the Department of Media, Music, Communication and Cultural Studies at Macquarie University in Sydney. Nicole's work brings together autobiography, disability and deaf studies, popular genres of broadcast and electronic media, and education. Her current research focuses on the convergence between mobile phones and digital hearing aids and considers the way these technologies might shape the way hearing, hard of hearing, and deaf people imagine these wearable technologies and the people who use them. So we've got the technology kind of coming in, like with Eric's painting style there as well. She has a long-standing interest in social justice-oriented listening in both political and professional settings. Her enduring interest is the role of media in processes of social and political change. Welcome, Nicole. Thank you for coming. Then we've got Rats Bedlington. Ratters is a Canberra turned Sydney artist whose work started with painting but has since collected every medium encountered, in particular performance installation, to maximize, I think was the word, maximize their shows. Inspired mainly by self-run bad art competitions, erotica from the 70s to 80s and medieval art, their work has an often kitsch, pornographic and absurd presence. Rat's work tends to focus on the idea of shrines, altars and spaces of contemplation, and like cognate, what is it?
Cognitive?
Oh.
How much has been well?
Offers an installation of spaces containing personal utopias or the artist's experience. Again, welcome, Matt.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Saba Vasefi. Dr. Saba Vasefi is a multi-award winning journalist, poet and documentary filmmaker. She is an honorary postdoctoral associate at Macquarie University, an academic at the University of Sydney, Sydney Peace Foundation Council member, and the Red Room Poetry's Writing in Resistance editor. Her poems have appeared in various journals, including Transnational Literature, Russafiri Magazine of International Contemporary Writing in the UK, Cordite Poetry, Australian Poetry, International Peer Review Journal, Axon, and the Best Australian Poets 2022, and the Art Gallery of New South Wales. She is the editor of Borderless, a transnational anthology of feminist poetry published in 2021. And also, because she is a poet, Saba is going to do a reading performance of a poetry piece before we do the Q&A and after we conclude the discussion. Again, welcome to all of you. Maybe a quick round of applause from the and we agreed beforehand that this is more like a less formal situation, not like an examination. So I was just going to throw it out with a question about, so how does listening and hearing, the right to listen, the right to be heard, the human rights aspect, how does any of this factor in your artistic practice, your professional practice? Has it inspired you in any way, shape or form? Maybe changed over the years, like we all have been in touch kind of a couple of times, go back and forth. And this is not for anybody like in particular. So anyone who might want to get us started there, please feel free to do so.
I mean, I think there's a really interesting shift happening in political culture around, a shift from saying, well, people need to speak and it's some voice, which I think was really important for the last few decades, to people going, well, yeah, it's all very well to ask people to talk about their pain, about the things that they've experienced as marginalised people, or, negative experiences that others might learn from. But it's pretty unethical to get them to do that without them listening to those stories. And so the Me Too movement would be one example, but there's lots of others. So I think that sort of shift to saying, well, it's a responsibility, our collective responsibility, and the responsibility of empowered people to listen and, not to expect people to have to tell the stories again and again and again and again. That's kind of seemed to me underpinning what Eric was saying. And I think that's a really important aspect of my work and things that are going on.
Right. Yeah, and I think if nobody wants to chime in immediately. I think because what you were saying about that listening becoming not just the chore of I have to listen, but actually it needs to be like integral to the whole process, and it needs to be part of the consideration. Like you might not know, but the University of Sydney, our Department of Indigenous Studies, Aboriginal Education, a fantastic department. I'm working with one of my colleagues over there, and that's where we did a podcast on the dairy, like with deep listening and stories of country. And that's what she taught me. The first thing was I'm a non-Aboriginal person, to listen, and what does listening mean with a purpose, intently, and not coming with all of the assumptions you have. And so I think that's why I'm drawn to Eric's work so much, because it's really giving you this jolt and making you aware that listening can happen in different ways. Anybody else?
I could add to that. Yeah, I was thinking about looking at Eric's figures, and I really enjoy how it looks like you're kind of trapped in a conversation with it, or they're trapped in a conversation with you, rather. So it's when you look at the image, it's they're forced to listen to something that you're trying to say, which I really enjoy. And I was thinking about when I paint a lot of figurative paintings, so there's always a figure, which for me, they're always a personification of an idea or a thing. I was just talking earlier about how I'm focused on astrophysical phenomena and sort of turning that stuff, which is really hard to comprehend, into kind of a figure. A human figure is really interesting, but when I'm painting them, I just kind of use these male forms as a kind of perverse, sort of turning the gaze on them as well. But I feel I'm painting them into being, and they're forced to listen to my conversation. So I think that's really fun. I like that about that work. Yeah.
That works.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what I'd like to say is that we have a lot of people that are speakers, a lot of people that talk, and the governments were like that for the last the recent government hasn't been, but the ones previous to that were, and they were just talking, but there wasn't a lot of listening, and so the internet has this thing that allows everybody to shout, to talk, to say, but it doesn't go in reverse that well. It doesn't work in reverse that well. So I think the digital age is making us. We have to find a way to listen in the digital age, I think.
Perhaps lurking's part of our solution there. Lurking, in internet spaces, going to spaces and not saying stuff, just listening.
Yeah.
I made a virtual reality work for a week. I worked with virtual reality, and at the end of that week, I thought, you can't make art in virtual reality. It's because I felt like virtual reality was the most self-centered space that I'd ever been in. So I made, I had a very interesting concept, and I found that when people watched it, all they were interested in was how big I can grow the flowers and when will that bird land on my hand. So then I was in an interview talking about that, saying I would never work in virtual reality again. I'd rather work with children in hospitals. And I got a light bulb moment. We had an application due for the Modern Acme VR Commission. And I said to the guy, we were in the interview together, I said, when is that due? And he said, tonight. I said, if we got time, I just came up with the best idea. So my idea was that taking on that it was a self-centered space, that when the VR is turned on, you've got 2 hand controls and a headset, that you are a colonial woman, and that everything that you do to the land, everything you do, so it says don't touch that button, or there's rabbits, if you touch the button, the trees fall down and their cows appear. If you throw the hand grenade, you blow up, you make factories. If you touch a rabbit, it breeds. And if you try to pat another one, it breeds until you can't move from rabbits. And I feel like, you know, for me, that was, I find really subtle, well, actually it's not, it's funny ways of trying to get people to listen.
Yeah.
So, you know, in my work, I do a lot of that sort of, they call me the silent punch, you know, like I pull you in, I bring you in to look at this, and then I like whack, you know, because I have really important messages. And I think, I mean, I think we live in such I don't think people really want to listen a lot of the time. They're just much more interested in, oh, what can I say next? How can I up that? How can I, you know, and I just think that Instagram, for example, is just, you know, making it even more pronounced.
Can I just stay with that for a moment? Because I think that's something I wanted to talk to Saba Beat about. So, as John was saying, people don't want to listen. How do you make them listen? How does it work? And maybe all of you, how do you make people listen? Maybe even if they don't want to listen, the silent punch.
I try. I mean, I know that. For example, I've got a work. I was just we had the Hadleys, $100,000 art prize. I got a highly commended in it. I was never going to win it, but I got a highly commended. And it's of an old white man made up of a couple of different figures. Anyway, he's an old white man. Next to him is a stump of a tree, and behind him is a landscape of cut down trees. And the title underneath it, so I fake all these up to make them look like old works. And underneath it, it says, those trees came back to me in my dreams. So what I start to do is I start to, I think, you know, as an artist, you have the opportunity to remake the world. You can make things up. You can, and what I've made, I feel like I've asked this man to go back and regret his actions.
And I feel that in my work, I'm giving the doorway. I'm opening a door for men like me that don't have the language. I'm learning the language, and I'm opening the door to learn that language, especially the Aboriginal language, and it's important. I find that really important. It's a growth process for me, because really we're targeting people of. I'm in this artwork. I'm targeting people my age and my gender, my I'm a person that has a lot of agency, which a lot of people don't have. So I think this work opens up those conversations, and I saw Joan's work, and it opened up a lot of conversation. The VR work, and because people were entranced by the fact that they were in this other world, you know, it was a totally different world, and it was a different conversation that was happening. Yeah.
Right. So maybe, Saba, if you might want to comment a bit on that, and then maybe Nicole as well, because so you're nodding like.
Yeah, I think I have different perspective in the context of Iran, for example. Navigating the notion of listening is kind of meaningless, because when you are under religious dictatorship, gender apartheid regime, there is no voice. Everything has been suffocated, and there is always punitive practices behind everything you talk about if it is going to cross the regime's hard line. So there is no voice. There is no multivocality. There is not freedom of speech, freedom of expression. All form of creative production should go through censorship of Ministry of Art and Culture. Everything should meet the criteria of radicalism and their ideology. Everything should, every production exposed to some sort of censorship. So when voice is not allowed to exist, how we can think about listening in that sort of environment? So I think, in my view, all the carceral spaces which can be defined as any form of incarceration, which can be carceral space. I am referring to any hybrid form of incarceration in the context of Iran can be as big as a country. Iran is a country, is a prison as big as a country. All aspect of your life is under control, surveillance, and suppression. So this is a characteristic of all form of carceral spaces, like detention regime, like dictatorship regime, that when voice is not allowed to exist. So this navigating or talking or even thinking about listening is crucial. If that
Sounds
makes
quite
sense.
radical, yeah.
Yeah.
Act of
And,
listening.
Yeah.
and a privilege.
Yeah.
Yeah, the privilege. Nicole, you were nodding there, maybe.
I guess I've done research in much more sympathetic spaces to the idea of listening. So I did a book a couple of years ago, which was looking at listening to first person narratives in health context. So things like the NHS in Britain and in, say, dementia care training in Australia. And one of the things that was really interesting about that is people widely viewed in these kind of health settings, they widely viewed people's stories, the stories of people who are health consumers or patients or, people with disability, whatever, however you want to define it, as being important. But it was very hard for people who were empowered in those health settings to actually listen to those narratives. So they had to kind of try and create, I kind of think it's interesting to think about listening as needing infrastructures. So it's not just about individuals' kind of conscientisation. Oh, I'm a listener now. And obviously part of that is legal structures or judicial structures and political structures. Sometimes it's about physical structures, like I've got single site of deafness, so a space that's not very acoustically friendly makes it really hard for me to listen if you're culturally deaf. Obviously you need interpreters or you need captioning. So thinking about listening as something that has got a kind of infrastructural dimension, and part of that might also be in a sort of affective infrastructural dimension, like thinking through, well, what makes it possible for people to listen to stories that might be confronting. So I spoke to some people who said, oh, look, it's really hard for nurses in the NHS in a sort of time of austerity to hear a story about the failure of the health system, which they're fully aware of, that they feel a sense of kind of moral, conflict about listening to their values being violated because of the fact they're working in a system that's so drastically underfunded and, poorly organised and everything. So they're not kind of emotionally able to take on the stuff that's being said, if you see what I mean, because it's so challenging to their core values that it's just overwhelming.
And I think that's a brilliant point, like, particularly when I came to Australia, it was like, all right, so you learn about histories and everything, and then you go to an Australian community or person, and then you unload that trauma, like just like taking that trauma, I'm like, yeah, but that's not their job, that's mine to work through.
That's interesting.
So I was interested in that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really like your point about the nurses being ones who have to like listen to those stories when they talk to them.
Yeah, they're listening, but also they're listening to people's everyday stories, but even trying to learn from stories about doing practice differently is difficult when you're in infrastructures, economic frameworks that don't make that easy to do. So you sort of feel bad that you're not doing what you should be doing. The people are saying, do this thing differently, but actually you're kind of locked in an environment where it's really difficult to do it. So I think that's sort of moving beyond a cognitive understanding of listening is just, if we have the insight, suddenly all of the structures will change. I think it's really important.
Right. So maybe that brings me to my next bigger question that I had, which was, as Nicole was framing it much more elegantly, the infrastructure of listening. So how does this infrastructure look like in a place like Australia, which was what Eric was really talking about? So there's certain, aspects like gender, ethnicity, race, like all plays into it. And maybe you can talk again from your experience or your professional practice about the infrastructure of that listening. What does listening look like? Maybe talk to us a bit about the positives that you've encountered, or maybe what technology has changed about listening, or has it improved it? Has it diminished it? I'm just finding from teaching here, and now I've been teaching it for 6 years, some things with the students, you can tell they're not listening at all because you're competing with the screen so much. So seeing and listening to me like become kind of like contradictory things at the moment. Then the question is always, how do you kind of get them back into this space of active listening? So Because then of like the second week they swear they listen to everything you said and they have done half of it. So it's always very interesting to do.
Yeah, I could extend on that. And it's kind of an extension of what you were just saying as well. Because my work sort of draws on personal experience, and a refusal to listen to certain things is very interesting to me. And it's like probably quite a universal experience. But for me, and I channel this experience to a lot of my work, is encountering, I'm non-binary, and trying to explain that to people is very, very interesting to me. And it's the kind of people at a pub that you might find who have this idea that it couldn't possibly be because they've discovered everything. There's no information left to listen to. And then on your point, the way that I interpret that is like very grandiose, but back to the kind of cosmological stuff that I channel, it's the ability for people's perception to change based on, I guess, modes of information. So I made a video where I'm embodying singularities or black holes, and they're speaking to the audience. And it's kind of in a way where it's like, you don't understand. You shouldn't even bother. You shouldn't look. How dare you? But it's kind of this like enraged feeling that's kind of involuntary sometimes with that stuff. But then to also listen to the other side of what they're saying, because there's a sort of more peaceful one. It's sort of saying there are different ways to look at this, because a singularity is sort of the limit of our understanding. But singularities exist in other ways as well, and they always have. A singularity would have been way beyond where we are now in the past, if that makes sense. So things have changed a lot technologically, which I think is interesting. That's what I'm fixated on.
And before we hear from the others, just because one quick point to follow up with that. So when you put your work out, right? So what do you think people respond? Like, how do people respond to it? Where do you put it out? What's the kind of the echo, the reverberations? What do you hear when you put things out to be heard?
Yeah, I can speak from the show that's current. People, it's a mixed reception. People are really scared of them because I've made them scary, like these black hole figures, because they are speaking at you quite angrily. But a lot of people just fixated by it because I've made them really colorful and sort of glittery. And then because of that, they listen to all of it. And it's a 5-minute video or so, but they always come out going, I think I get that, which I find it's really good. That's successful for me. I was surprised, but they listen. Yeah.
So so I work with RAT, and so I came into the so we work at the MCA together, where Gallery hosts, and I came into the institution with a singularity sort of attitude because I didn't really know much about anything about binary existence, and RAT's been my teacher. So I gingerly went up and asked him about fingernails, and because he commented on somebody's fingernail polish in the gallery, and I said, so tell me about your fingernail polish, and so this is the way that I could actually start to have a conversation with Rat about what I didn't know about. So I wanted to show him that I was going to listen to what he was going to say. And so, yeah, it was about sitting there and actually listening. And Rat's a great teacher in that way. So this is why I really wanted Rat to come along, because I really wanted to open up this conversation, and it's really sad to hear that in Iran there is no conversation like this, and that's what I really want to say. From my point of view.
But then just going on a bit more about the infrastructure, I think, as Eric just pointed out, conversation is one of the bridges there, but maybe going back to Nicole and John as well, so again, what does this infrastructure of listening look like in your practice, in your experience with? I think that point is really interesting about the scary singularity, like the glittery at night.
Can I again jump in? So I'll just jump in again. I had so in the MCA, the infrastructure there is we've got labeling down low. And this lady came in and said, why is the labeling down so low? And I said, well, because of the wheelchair access. And people with wheelchairs can see the label. 1% of people, 1% of people, we have to bend down. And I got it back, and I said, well, 1% of people, yeah, but now we're an inclusive society. We actually allow these people to actually see the label at that high, and it's quite a nice thing to do. And the MCA is an inclusive, and it showed me that they were inclusive because I'm an older person. So for somebody to hire me, meant a great deal to me. So, and she was an older person. So it's bringing it back to the person that's actually doing the being mean, really, and that's the way I go about it in that setting. So
And again, Nicole, if maybe you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of, in some ways, your art, Eric, is interesting because it kind of, because I've done a little bit of stuff about hearing devices and deafness, it sort of like uses a metaphor that puts the empowered person as the non-listener. But in some senses, it's kind of ironic to me because I'd say deaf and hard of hearing people are often the best listeners, like so flexible. I've had so many experiences. I've been learning sign language for many years, of just the willingness of deaf people to switch tracks. Okay, we can't communicate this way. Oh, does someone have a pen and paper, or can we use gesture, or does someone have some ASL, or you know what I mean? Just being, I've got my app that can transliterate, and that. I think there's a really interesting parallel to, monocultural or monolingual environments where people, and I wonder whether this is hearing people more broadly, or is it hearing people in Anglophone worlds where they're not used to code switching? Maybe that's an issue.
It might be.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just find it really interesting to think about the one of the infrastructures that we might consider, like you're saying, Eric, in the context of captioning. I'm not sure that universal design always works, but flexibility of kind of modes of communicating and willingness to take on a different paradigm and sort of go, okay, this doesn't work for everybody. I mean, for example, I don't know, the quiet hours that they have in shopping centres now for neurodiverse people. There's a kind of an attention to diverse needs in that action, but there's also a sort of an understanding that people's kind of sensoria differ, and so having to be aware of that all the time, I think that's one of the ways you can make a listening infrastructure, is just be willing to change things,
And one good example of that was when I was sitting up downstairs, a man came in and said, "Oh, my daughter's deaf." And it was really interesting that when she went through the cochlear implant, getting a cochlear implant, we were put into a room to hear what my daughter would hear, and she said it was garbled. It was garbled that we were listening to, but I'm so proud of my daughter that she can actually make English out of that. And that was such a, and that was from just looking at my drawings, So
that's
I thought,
so interesting.
we're getting some of it.
And that's, I think, as Nicole, you were saying, there's now trial runs. I don't know if people are following these news, but there's a supermarket chain in the Netherlands, and they're actually now offering chatty cash out. But,
Such a great idea.
there's a lot of older people living by themselves, and then there's this phenomenon of over simplification. So a lot of people living by themselves, and it's called like this new pandemic of social loneliness. And they're being offered a special checkout where they can just talk to the cashier. There's nobody pushing you on.
Such a good idea.
And it's so successful that they now got, I think, like 10% more revenue because of that, because people wanting to talk and then they're finding it interesting.
Yeah.
So they have specific dedicated lanes to be
Such a great
different.
idea. Yeah.
And I think that's the cliche of accommodating is not, helping capitalism when people all factor in. But again, that would maybe Sally can talk a bit about it, because I've got another question about technology actually in that case. But
When I came to Australia, I was thinking, okay, wow, I have a platform, I have a voice, democracy, fantastic. And then gradually I was learning how the roof of freedom of speech is, limited. Because when I went to Australian Film, Television and Radio School to study documentary filmmaking, they would keep asking me Australian content. Otherwise, you will not be granted. You would not have money to make any film. And I was thinking, I just arrived in Australia. I don't know anything about Australia. And I made my first short film. Because I escaped from Iran with my little daughter. She was little, now she's taller than me. And she was a cellist in Sydney Youth Orchestra, and now she's doing music. I filmed her underwater and it was her struggle to be heard. And underwater you cannot hear anyone. And later on, when I start to make my second film, again the problem was Australian content. Otherwise, I could not make my landmark documentary. And I came with the idea, okay, I know because I was campaigner against execution in Iran, and I was thinking, I don't have any idea about Australia's history, but I know so many things about execution. And I made my second documentary about first Australian female parliamentarian whose father was executed in Australia, I think 80 years ago, 90 years ago. And it was interesting because my supervisor told me, it's interesting, the theme of suffocation and struggle or claustrophobia is a common theme of all of your work, your creative practices. And gradually I learned how can I talk with visual languages. People would not bully my accent. People would not judge me. And Islamic Republic sympathizer would less bully me because it's difficult for them to understand the metaphor. Is that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it was my experience. And later on, when I started to write about women and children in detention center on offshore detention regime on Nauru, I realized I always was thinking about a Spivak argument article, can subaltern speak? And through my work, writing about those women on Nauru detention regime in Western context, I was thinking, yes, we can talk, but who gonna listen to them? And that's why I created Writing and Resistance Project in collaboration with the Art Gallery of New South Wales and Red Room. And I tried to use my personal experience to mentor them, to tell their own story without pasteurization of media system in a poetic structure, because in that way, people listen to them much more than before. And in this way, we can humanize the narrative, which has been dehumanized through media, through advocacy system and policy.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. And I think you can see now all these threads around listening and being listened to coming together there, which brings me to my next question. That's okay, which is about technology and how does technology play a part in this process of getting people to listen, speaking in other ways? How do
Can I
you
jump on this one? I was teaching exactly this one today. Cyberspace, the digital platforms, I think it's a kind of, there are so many limitations to be involved in the digital platforms in online environment, but I think cyberspace provided in some level some form of liberty and emancipation for women in, as I said, in carceral spaces such as Iran and detention system. But I acknowledge, and I am one of those people constantly, I have been trolled a lot, and as you know,
Yeah.
and there is another limitation that can, Islamic Republic regime, they recruited 2,000 people on their cyber army. They are paying people to use cyberspace to silencing people. But in another way, with all those limitations, I think the cyberspace provided massive amount of emancipatory space for suppressed people who don't have any representation in human rights industry or media within Iran. And as I said, in detention regime, for example, just women who do not have any representation in Iranian Islamic Republic media system, they take out their hijab they fire their hijab, and they feel themselves and they share their idea and their own reality through cyberspace, and through cyberspace they can deterritorialize, colonize territory.
Excellent. And yeah, the technology, they
Technology.
brought it right.
Yeah, positive and negative side. Yeah.
We might just go down whoever wants to answer or has something they would like to add there. Technology and listening, speaking, hearing.
It's hard to generalize. I think, I think the moment of hyperbole is over about the internet. And I think, it's easy to have a kind of a heuristic about internet spaces that suggest they're all problematic, or new technologies suggest they're all problematic. I used to do a lecture where I got little snippets about, things people said about the novel, things people said about silent cinema, things people said about video games. They're all the same. They'll make everybody randy and have short attention spans, and the working class people will, children will be corrupted. So I found that really interesting. But so I'm kind of always a bit wary about making broader generalizations. But I think the lens that I think is interesting the deaf studies has brought to these kinds of debates, and disability studies as well, is to try and think about technologies beyond a paradigm that's about individual, and here I'm thinking more assistive technologies, beyond individual amelioration or normalization of bodies, so the person who might be struggling to hear, having to be responsible for managing the environment such that they can hear, and try and use technologies as a way of, I get a famous writer in this area, Alan Rawson, says kind of ameliorating environments rather than ameliorating individuals, or, kind of getting individuals to have to internalize the need to constantly do extra work, to constantly, be responsible for making sense of what other people are saying. So I think if we analyse the ways media technologies and assistive technologies are used to think about, okay, so what ways are we changing the environment rather than just changing individuals' capacity to engage, I think that's a good thing to do.
And that's a brilliant point, and it goes back to something I saw on YouTube now really being popular, this genre of, first time the person hears something, the implant or something that gets turned on.
Oh God,
All
yeah,
of the
that's so
content,
popular.
like all of the comments that go, oh yeah, no, that's fantastic. And then some advocates go, but maybe that person doesn't want it, and that's a lot of pressure. So as you say,
It's a kind of rhetoric of technology is that, and the magic bullet, and the idea that all deaf people want cochlear implants, which they don't, and that cochlear implants instantly change people's hearing, which they don't, and that that somehow you can just ameliorate individual bodies, and then everybody else can go on doing the same stuff. We don't need to change anything. We don't need to take responsibility for communication or flexibility of communication. We'll just leave it to the deaf person to do all the extra work.
So I guess it ties it back to Eric about that idea. But yeah, hopefully we can talk a bit more, because we have about 5 minutes left for the discussion, and then throw it to the audience. But maybe Joe.
I'm not going on from what you said. I'm going on just in terms of technology, and not about my art. I'm really fascinated by what's happening to children who aren't being listened to by their parents because their parents are on the phone. I've watched children down at Bondi nearly drown because their parents are on the phone. I've watched people used to walk with their babies in the pram looking at them. Now what people do is the baby's facing out and they're on their phone. I'm watching it all the time. I spoke to a woman the other day who's an occupational therapist, and I was very touched by this woman because she started telling me experiences of working with children, and how a lot of the children with behavioural problems weren't being listened to by their parents. And I did just start to tell this story before, but this woman told a story about a little girl. She was I think about a 6-year-old, getting into a lot of trouble at school, sent to the occupational therapist, and she was quite suspicious of her because, there was another professional person trying to fix her, and this woman was the best listener I've ever come across. And she would have been listening on body-wise, she watches gestures, and she was really there for that little girl. And the little girl said to her, okay, you are like the angel Gabriel to me, and I can work with you. she said. And I just feel like, you know, just on a broader level, you know, the ability to actually listen,
Stop.
to actually listen and be quiet and not competitive in our just our daily lives, you know. And I think that, you know, I get upset with watching the parents on the phones, you know. And I understand what undivided attention does for a child, and I worry about these future generations, actually. Yeah.
We do that in the gallery.
Yeah.
And we might come back to that in terms of, like, I think I might have stressed it. So the Australasian Humour Studies Network is about humour, and we've got one of the members here, Professor Rockfidian, who might be able to talk a bit more about, because there's meme going around of a mum looking on a phone, and then the baby was, like, I think almost run over by a car. So it was, the meme went viral, and people were like, is this like shaming the mother? As you know, Nicole was saying, like, who are we shaming? Who at whose expense? And like paying attention and listening, I think goes in that direction. So maybe that's something to pick up later. Last question before we actually hand it to Zaba and your poem. And this might be a curveball for some, but how does humor, to keep it in the theme of the network, how does humor factor into all of this? Eric, we know from yours. So maybe you want to get us going. How does
absolutely.
humor factor into listening and being heard?
So my is I use humour as a starting point, and because I'm a cartoonist, well, I was a cartoonist, now an artist. It's always something that's it allows an audience to come to my work with a laugh, and then a bit like Joan coming in with a punch at the end, you know. But it's about bringing the listener in, actually. Yeah, it's about bringing the listener in and maybe contemplating. But you know, I mean, that's a bit wafty to think that people will contemplate what I've done, would change their mind. But maybe we're starting that conversation, and it's just fantastic conversation that we had today about maybe. Opening up this big paradigm that could get us to a point where we could actually sit and listen to each other in one big room for a long time and not say a word. Anyway, that's my hope.
I've got a good one from the bio at the start, because it was mentioned that I do bad art competitions, and it's true. And I call them talentation. But I mention that when I write little artist bios like that, because it's actually quite important, even though it's a side little joke thing with friends. But you set it up, people just show up, there's a theme. So the last one was sound art, anything goes. And it's amazing because it's mostly artists that come. It's amazing how critical they become of things that they've noticed in the art world. And it usually gets quite political. And I record it all and take great inspiration from it. I don't know if I've used it really yet, but stand by. Yeah.
I mean, I think that, look, humour is a way of disarming people, and where they can sort of soften a little bit. You know, they're not, you know, sometimes when we're confronted too harshly, we don't listen, we stop listening. But when we, you know, are approaching in a different way, we actually listen. I don't like to talk about being funny, but I do actually use a lot of humour to seduce people.
Yeah, looking at your artwork, I think there's such subtlety around the humors where you're using the neon color. Anyway, I thought, come to the Brisbane conference next year, present, you know. Looking forward to it. Nicole, you know. I mean, again,
my PhD about a billion years ago was about comedy film, and I kind of think that we can, back in the Paleolithic era, but I kind of think in some ways humour can go both ways. People like to think of humour as being something that's potentially transgressive and shaking things up, but I guess I've always been interested as well in the way that humour can be used to kind of articulate quite conservative views as well. So I think it's not an automatic opening of minds and doors, and yeah, I think as long as we think about it that way, it certainly is useful. I think there's a bit of a tendency in human studies to want to see it as always a fine thing. But I'm not sure that it always is, but it's interesting.
We come back to this in a moment. So
I think humor is a skill, and it can add aesthetic to the discussion, to just soften all those harsh arguments about just when you talk about colonialism, post-colonialism, state violence, those kind of topic. Whenever I'm talking, I realize, oh my God, just I get a slap on my face if I go further and on deeper level. So yeah, I think, and I try to build up this skill in Australia, because in Iran, if you, as a woman, if you have a sense of humor, it would be really not very appropriate. They stigmatize you as a person who is crossing the border of chastity, morality. So, but in Australia, I realized, no, there is another form of, censorship or more, I need to be very careful when I'm talking about gender racism, for example, in a very serious way. And then I start to develop this skill. I'm at the beginning of this journey, because for whole of my life, I learned to be very serious in order to, comply with all those regulations. And
right.
But I think I was born in Glasgow, and if I didn't have a sense of humour, I got slapped.
Oh, really? Yeah, okay.
It's a leveler.
Yeah. Yeah, women issue, probably. Yeah.
Right. Well, thanks so much. This is the first bit. We're going to have the discussion in a moment. Shifting gears now, trying to bit back to maybe the not humorous part, but Saba, would you like to do the polling?
Sure, let's meet.
And then we have the Q&A bit where I'm going to again come very close to the mic.
تو رفتی و دلم غمین شد، غریق آه آتشین شد، از آن شبی که برنگشتی، جهان که شادی آفرین بود، به چشم من غم آفرین شد، از آن شبی که برنگشتی. I orbit like a sun, forgetful of how to shed either light or warmth. I turn and turn, an aimless gypsy, the world's most frantic sunflower. We are not alone in our loneliness. Exile is a crowded solitude. This spheric world is overrun with outsiders, and I am an outsider. Look at the owl. See how holds her wings around her hollowness and sleeps. But every morning she calls the broken branches perish. Do we think we are less than the bats that hang and intone their anguish to the dark? Are we less than the rooster whose early morning never knew a night? The clocks still run on Greenwich Mean Time, but perhaps this place is another time now, and here perhaps it's God who faces the firing squad, not us. And no longer will we need to dress up our kisses in disguise. We are not strangers anymore, neither estranged nor estranged. Here alone, we are all of us kin. Thank you.
And again, thanks to all of the guests so far. That was just brilliant. As you can see, very different takes and approaches and ways of listening and being listened to and being heard. Now we're going to throw it open for questions from the audience. Again, I'm going to come around. If you have a question, please let me know.
Hi, thank you. That was really fascinating to listen to. When you were in your opening talk, Eric, you said that you want to be listened to, and I really responded to that. It felt very earnest and something that's quite relatable. And I think I wanted to ask in response as a general question to everyone here, is there, how do I word it? How do you maintain or feel a conviction in your want to be listened to? Why do you want to be listened to? What makes you feel a purpose in that? I guess I'm asking because that's something I struggle with.
Should I answer? So for me, it's an internal process that needs that happens every time I start drawing or I start doing an artwork. So once that artwork becomes, I want it to be listened to. I think that's probably the only. And then that I use Instagram in that way. I don't really care what I put up on Instagram as long as it's something that I've produced and has meaning to me. And I think that's a basic human need. I think.
I can talk about it as well. I don't know. I'm not an advocate for any voice other than mine. So for me, I still have stuff to say. That's literally it. And I just have an urge to make art. I think it's kind of a primal urge, really.
Mm.
Yeah. Listen to me. Yeah. That's pretty much it. Yeah. So I think it's fine.
I think it's human desire to be connected, to be loved, to be respected, to belong to somewhere, to some community. You know, it's our nature to be in the community. So when you think you are listened, you have been heard, it gives you some sense of belonging, respect, love. Yeah.
I'm kind of interested in the role of someone like myself might play, not as a person saying something in my own right, although I do some life writing stuff and I'm interested in that. But as what my colleague Tanya Dreyer said, described as listening brokers. Like I think there are structures that can be created where there's amplification of certain types of voices, where you can, try and gather together or comment on or supplement the work of other people who are trying to speak, sort of say, okay, look at this is worth listening to. So I think that idea of, so I guess curators play that role, or Ben might be playing that role in this environment, as a person who actually brings together people talking about their own experiences. So I think that's a sort of undervalued kind of role, brokering and kind of curating or caretaking lived experience narratives. They tend to get generated and then they kind of fall by the wayside, a bit of soft money or whatever. Maybe it's the same with the art world. So I think that idea of actually these things require maintenance and they require people to disseminate them and share them. And I can kind of think in my academic work, I can try to contribute to that a little bit.
I think I'm preliminarily and I'm primarily an artist, but I'm a teacher. And I want to talk to people about work. I want to talk to people about things that I think they're not listening to. And I approach my work from many different levels. So my work is very layered. My video animations are used in schools a lot. I'm in the curriculum and I absolutely love that because, I made my work very purposely so I could communicate and so people would listen and children would listen to things that they weren't listening to, that the Australian population I didn't think was hearing.
Just very quickly, thank you for your contributions. Do you feel political correctness has compromised the way you like to be heard or express your opinions?
I'm happy to say something. I think that the word political correctness no one really uses it to talk about their own practices. It's always used as a term to describe other people's practices. And, I'm pretty old now. So, back in the sort of 80s when I first went to uni, in Australia, we didn't really use that term. We might, except ironically, ideological soundness might have been the more tongue-in-cheek version of the same thing. So, I kind of think that it's a term that is used to describe what other people are doing. But in my view, a kind of, Noam Chomsky talks about, the best way to make people think there's a debate is to allow very free debate within a very, very limited sphere and pretend there's no outside to that. And I often think that the mediascape is a bit like that. So, I don't know, the Greens being seen as crazy bonkers lefties, in the Australian political scene. Really, they're not. They're kind of social democrats. In Germany, they would be like very standard mainstream party. So we've managed to create an environment in which the sphere of debate is so small that little tiny moves outside that space get seen as, oh, look, the crazy lefties are at it again, or look at these bonkers feminists or whatever. So I kind of think, I think the idea that somehow, and I also think we don't pay enough attention to the spheres where certain things are policed and the spheres where they're not policed. So you get great anxiety about political correctness on campus, but actually the bigger spaces, the wider spaces that we have are, highly dominated by a very, very narrow range of voices, usually, Murdoch papers, usually, middle-class people, white people, et cetera, et cetera. So the spaces that are sort of alternative spaces where your work might be foregrounded or, perhaps universities, perhaps, an alternative cafe, people get very hot and bothered about the limited number of voices there, but not really hot and bothered about, the perspective in No Flies on You, but the Australian precedents, which has been so homogenous for so long. So I just kind of think, oh, well, really, why are we worried about that? That doesn't worry me in the slightest. I'm much more worried about the mediascape more broadly.
I can add to that as well. Excuse me. But it's like, I feel that if people sort of use that term, it's usually not accurate either. So in my work, no, because when I'm creating work, it's usually in a kind of listening dialogue with things that I might think might not be okay. And, sometimes they get chopped out. And that's it. That's the political correctness, I guess. And usually that term is used by people when it's sort of directed at them for missteps that they've made. And I think it's pretty easy not to make those if you start the dialogue with listening rather than putting stuff out and then getting told that it's not okay.
So, and also, I just want to say one more thing about political correctness. They're polemics. So they're big polemics on one side, big polemics on the other. But there's a Venn diagram that shows there's a little grey line in between, and I think we said it in the spiel, that there is a place for us to start the conversation in that polemic. So one polemic, the other polemic. There is a space there that we can start having a conversation. And Stan Grant talked about that when he was talking about Adam Goodes and the way that he got hammered on the field. That Adam Goodes was trying to talk about his feelings, but nobody was listening, and that was a space that he wants to occupy. He wants to occupy that grey space so that we can talk about Adam Goodes' feelings. We can talk about why racism's there, and then there's a grey space, and then maybe if we as a society can dwell within that grey space, I think we can start. Doing this sort of stuff, and opening up the conversation.
There's a new discourse which is emerging, which draws upon human knowledge, but is a machine language, and it's a machine rationale. How do you see that as about it? I think it's going to have ramifications as far as what people listen to and a new authority, if you want to call it that. But it's an authority with that is problematic in a lot of ways. I mean, we've already seen some of the consequences of that, but it will become more authoritative as it becomes more machine-like, I guess, and less human, I think.
Well, in art, I think it's become boring already. Because really, when we see what AI can do in art, we see it over and over and over again, and it's not progressive.
But I'm using it in my own practice. And it is, you start using it, you just play it. It's a jumping off point for ideas, and it can generate thousands of ideas. And so it's a tool, but that's not always the way that it's going to be used. And it depends on whether it's a corporation using it or whether it's an individual or a community, and so forth.
And it's also counteractive with me because I'm using digital imagery, and people would think that was already produced by an AI. So.
Yep.
Yeah, it is. That's why I try to paint over the top of my paintings to show that I've actually got agency. So,
I want to talk about Grimes because she made a video recently, and I'm not a huge advocate for Grimes, the musician, but she did say something really interesting recently about chess and how chess is like a AI-free environment when it comes to human appreciation of it. And I think there's going to be a similar potential thing with things like painting, where the human aspects of art are the valued bits, and that the AI bits are there. So people still verse AI chess, and it's still important, it's still used, and it's still chess, but it's not the product that we're looking for. I think it'll be a bit more, really. Yeah.
It's very interesting though, isn't it? I mean, what happens when, medical students start, not learning, just using ChatGPT?
I think it can accelerate learning. It's recording on here.
Yeah.
Quite significantly and in different ways. So you use it as a kind of jumping off point. For example, there were some scientists who recently, they were looking at ways that AI could help with immunology and things like this. And what it did was generate 40,000 possibility new chemical. So it's going to benefit pharmaceutical companies, but it's also going to benefit some people, health-wise. So it's a kind of jumping off point for those scientific students. So I think it's going to become a really useful tool in a lot of ways. But on the other hand, it's going to blur the distinctions between truth. It can distort reality.
I mean, it is interesting because I have a fairly wide brain. I can come up really quite quickly with 8 different ways to approach a number of different objects, for example. But I can't come up with it that quickly. And so when I've done it and I've watched what it does, I can't help but to want to use it sometimes as a jumping off point. It's just like, oh my God, I never thought of that, ever.
So we might just, because we only have time for, we have time for one more question. And I think, if you'd like to continue that discussion, because I think that's fascinating, can you unsee or unhear these things? So that is really, that is that. But anyway, one more question before we have to close out.
So there's also an element of collaboration, that we can collaborate with the AI, and artistically we can. I've thought about how I can collaborate with AI, and it would be interesting to, because I'm quite a fast drawer. I'd be interested to see how fast I can draw to what AI can produce. But I'm sure that AI will produce a beautiful finished rendering, and I'd have a little line work. But
I know, but also the thing about it is it's computer generated, and when we're talking about the actual hand, that's what you're saying. People are going to start valuing as time goes by the hand.
It's going to be an interesting question.
It's going to be interesting.
And another.
How that's going to affect people listening, particularly.
Yeah.
What they listen to.
Oh, yeah.
Another element of the AI is that it's all derivative of what we've already made,
That's it.
which is interesting as well.
It's been put in.
Yeah,
It's been-
which I can't get my head around. So
I don't know
yeah.
where this goes, but apropos of what you're saying about health in particular, that I heard on the health report the other day that there was a study done comparing the sort of empathetic murmurings of AI to, as in chatbot form, to actual doctors talking to patients, and AI, it won every time over actual doctors. It was more empathetic, according to, and I was like, wow, that's, I don't know where that goes, but it just kind of made me think, okay, maybe we need to step back from humanism and have a little bit of a think about it.
Yeah, well, librarians here.
But in robot,
You can go up to a computer and say, I want all the list of, recently cited articles. Can you summarize them for me? And
It will make up something, probably. That's the problem you're pointing to, isn't it?
Maybe
That's always
this should
happening.
be the class in the medical school
Ah.
on empathy. and
Improve on the bot. I like it.
but in robotics, we had somebody at the conference talking about robotics and saying, well, no, a robot will never overtake the human form. So
Well, they also had a robot there that they wanted to laugh realistically, like an actual person at somebody's jokes. I think they were trying to save all, the women out there from bad man jokes, and have a robot laugh at them or something like that. And it did not work out. So that was an interesting project there. We're almost out of time, so I just had one last question, unless there's another question there. I was just wanting to know, and this is something I had thought about, so if you feel completely uncomfortable, you do not have to answer that. What's the favorite word that you would like to hear over and over again? What's the favorite thing, the word that's your most favorite thing to hear? Which word is that?
empathy for me.
Safety.
I can't think of a word. The sound of eucalyptus leaves rustling in the trees. That would be what I'd like to listen to.
I like enthusiastic squealing, laughter. Yeah, it's always good.
I'm going for a magpie.
And with that, we are out of time. Thank you so much for the discussion. Thanks to the audience for coming.